My name is Tzvi Brevik, Chairperson of the Cape South African Jewish Board of Deputies, and thank you for joining us for the Cape Town Remembers the Holocaust Vignette series. This year commemorates the 80th anniversary of the destruction of the Jewish communities in Lithuania and Latvia. In just 3 months between July and September of 1941, the vast majority of the Jews in the Lithuanian and Latvian provinces had been killed, as well as many of the Jews in the cities, who were all in ghettos by November. The majority of Jews living in South Africa today are descendants of immigrants from Lithuania and Latvia who came to South Africa between 1880 and 1930 to seek refuge from poverty, persecution, and discrimination. There had been Jews in Lithuania since 1316, in Latvia from the 15th century, but by the time the Germans retreated from Lithuania in the summer of 1944, 95% of Lithuanian Jews had been murdered. When Germany surrendered in 1945, only a few thousand Lithuanian Jews had survived. By war's end, nearly all of the 70,000 Jews living in Latvia in 1941 had perished. Within weeks of the invasion, the Germans had imprisoned the Jews in ghettos and had instituted a systematic campaign to murder all of the Lithuanian Jewry, led by the Asens Commandos, mobile killing groups composed of SS and police personnel. Their operations were carefully planned and were carried out according to a strict timetable, and accurate statistics were kept of their achievements. The Asensgruppen would move into an area, pits would be dug, their victims would be brought to the site, lined up beside the pit, and executed by shooting. The booty would then be taken from the corpses and the pits filled in. Sometimes the Jews would be assembled in a shul that would be set on fire. The Asensgruppen would then move on to the next area. Within a few months, communities that had been living and contributing to their homelands for centuries were annihilated. The Lithuanian and Latvian influence lives on in the strong, cohesive South African Jewish community only because their ancestors decided to leave Eastern Europe. This year, let us mourn the loss of our families and the contribution they could have made to the world. We now welcome a message from the State of Israel, the Ambassador Lior Keinan.
Dear Holocaust survivors, rabbis, Jewish leadership, schools, members of the diplomatic corps, dear friends. We find ourselves at the start of the second year of the ongoing coronavirus pandemic. This was a difficult year for us all, but it was especially trying for the Holocaust survivors. For many survivors, the lockdowns at home brought back the harsh memories they cannot forget. The decade of complete darkness they had to face, surrounded only with absolute evil. In this year's ceremony, I unfortunately cannot meet the survivors personally, but I would like to at least send them these words in support from afar. I would also like to dedicate this day in the memory of Holocaust survivor Veronica Phillips, Zichronah Livracha, who has just recently passed away. Veronica was one of the bravest and most special people I have met in my life, and I am so grateful I had the privilege to know her. May her memory be a blessing. While many of us would be glad to erase this last year from our lives, for anti-Semitism, no time was lost. The lockdowns around the world may have reduced the physical violence aimed at Jewish communities, but we have found ourselves confronting a different type of violence. New conspiracy theory emerge daily, placing the blame for the pandemic on the Jews. A recent Oxford University study, for example, found that one out every 5 British citizens believed the Jews had spread the virus in order to destroy the British economy. The leaders of these dangerous developments are the BDS organization and Iran, whose leaders have compared the coronavirus pandemic to the Zionist pandemic and have called their supporters to fight against it until they are rid of both. The Israeli response to this reaction has been, as always, with more action than words. Israel signed peace agreements with 4 Middle Eastern and Northern African countries, while at the same time becoming the leader in vaccinating its citizens and even in developing medication to the pandemic. We must continue to do just that, to fight an uncompromising fight against violence and anti-Semitism wherever it rears its ugly head, and in parallel to continue our hard work to make Israel an even safer place for all Jews around the world. All this to ensure that the Holocaust will never occur, will never again.
2-minute moments of silence are observed across Israel, accompanied from start to finish by air raid sirens sounded throughout the country. The nation stands silently as the siren wails, remembering those who had perished. Surprisingly, that tradition had its beginnings in Cape Town during World War I, when the mayor, Sir Harry Hands, initiated a 2-minute pause with the firing of the noon gun. The sounds of the sirens, while reminding us of the sound of the shofar, symbolizes mourning and action. It reminds us of the struggles of the Jewish life and action to make never again a reality. Zola Shuman's parents were both survivors of the Vilna ghetto and labor camps. Her mother, Chayala Rosenthal, was known as the Nightingale of the ghetto. After the war, impresario Sol Horrock heard her singing and took her touring America and Europe until she decided to make Cape Town her home. Delighting audiences everywhere with her singing and acting, her last role was as Goldie in Fiddler on the Roof. Dying of cancer a week after it was closed, her father, Xavier Paetke, was a journalist whose passion for ensuring that the memories of survivors were presented and preserved led to the publication of the book In Sacred Memory, in which 50 Cape Town survivors' memories were recorded. Zola herself is a well-known singer, songwriter, and composer.
My name is Zola, and I am the daughter of 2 Holocaust survivors, Xavier Paetke and Chayala Rosenthal. 80 years ago today, in the town of Vilna, my father, 21-year-old Israel Yutan, already a respected journalist for local newspapers, wrote an article about a local teenager, Chayala Rosenthal, my mother, who had just won a national singing competition and had been invited to perform in Moscow at the upcoming International Song Festival. My mother was so excited to go to Russia, but sadly, it was not meant to be. For days later, her beautiful voice playing on the radio was suddenly drowned out by the deafening sound of explosions and the deep rumbling drone of German low-flying Stuka airplanes that filled the sky, dropping bombs onto their beloved Vilna. Within days, life for the Jews in Vilna changed for the worse. Jews were dismissed from employment, and soldiers began rounding up Jewish males and sending them off to work for Germans wherever they saw fit. Not all returned home. Lithuanians searched Jewish homes for weapons and stole items of value. Jews were being targeted and publicly humiliated daily. One afternoon, my grandfather, a well-known doctor and councilman, was grabbed by locals as he was walking in the streets. They pointed guns at him, ordering him to get down on his knees and clean the street with his bare hands, while they stood laughing, cursing at him and kicking him, as they did to so many others. My father recalled how one day when he was standing in line for a bread ration, the locals pushed him to the back, to the end of the line, again and again, till he was forced to walk back home, empty-handed. Overnight, the respect and dignity of the Jews were ripped away in every single moment of every single day, at each corner of every street. There was always a threat of personal attack, humiliation, and ugly violence. 80 years ago, on July 4th, Einsatzkommando No. 9 rolled into the city. Deployed from the unit of Einsatzgruppen B, these armed and uniformed SS men, together with their Lithuanian collaborators, forced Jews out of their homes or kidnapped them off the streets under the pretext that they were being taken away to work outside of the city. Instead, those Jews were marched to the Lukiski prison yard, where they were held outdoors for several days, and then taken to the Ponari forest, where they were brutally murdered, mercilessly shot, their bodies falling into pits and ravines, buried in anti-tank ditches, quarries, and gorges. My mother's father, Nochem Rosenthal, who was the owner and the editor of Der Ovend Courier, Vilna's most popular Yiddish daily newspaper, was among the first to be taken and shot. At first, the killings were aimed at those who were easily accessible, the Jewish males, particularly those in leadership positions and members of the intelligentsia. Their families were then forced to pay ransom to try and get them back home, but none returned. The killings soon escalated to include all Jewish men, women, and children. Einsatzkommando 9 carried out these actions day after day until they left the city at the end of July. Relief was short because just days later, Einsatzkommando 3, a unit of Einsatzgruppen A, entered Vilna, and those horrific mass murders were continued, one action after another. On the 1st of September, my mother's grandparents, neighbors, and her best friend were taken away, along with 5,000 more Vilna Jews, each having been told to pack and bring soap and a change of clothing. They were going to work, but all were taken away to be killed. A week later, on the 6th of September, the Germans set up 2 ghettos for the remaining Vilna Jews. Ghetto number 1 housed those who could work, who could be a useful labor force, while the smaller ghetto number 2 imprisoned the unproductive, the weak, the sickly, and elderly Jews, soon to be systematically gotten rid of over time. That same day, on the 6th of September, Lithuanian police and SS men ordered my father and his family to leave their home and belongings, forcing them into ghetto number 1. They moved into a small room to be shared with 8 others. Food was scarce, and a public kitchen was established where people could get a few rations, some soup, some weak tea. Usually the first meal was at midday. Some of those who worked outside the ghetto were given soup and a piece of bread by their employers. Soon, some brave and bold workers arranged for supplies to be snuck in and out of the sewers in secret places, bringing more food and other products necessary for survival into the ghetto. The underground resistance risked their lives listening to smuggled-in radios in the hopes of learning more about the war's progress. But mostly, Jews had very little knowledge of the Nazis' plans, living in constant fear, never knowing when the next action or attack would be. They just knew it would come at any time. At all times, the Jews were forced to wear the identifying yellow Star of David on their clothing. They were forbidden to walk on pavements. They had to walk in the middle of the street on those uneven cobbled stones that were hard on the frail and the elderly. In those first few weeks of ghetto life, Jews continued to be murdered by the Einsatzkommando units every single day. It seemed like many of those with work permits, called a Shane, were mostly spared the consequences of the actions. My father and his father were fortunately each issued with a yellow Shane and were assigned different work projects outside of the ghetto walls, which could be why they survived a few more daytime actions. My mother's brother, Leib Rosenthal, already a well-known published author, poet, and political activist, was helped by his literary friends to get his yellow Shane and later the pink Shane that would keep his family safe. Leib was assigned to work in a unit whose purpose was gathering of documents, books, works of art, and other important archives from the internationally recognized YIVO, the Vilna-based Jewish Scientific Institute. His job was to make a list in German of the inventory for the Nazi record keepers who planned to transport all archives and artifacts of Jewish historical significance from YIVO back to Germany, where the literature would either be destroyed or kept as relics of an exterminated society. In secret defiance, Leib hid some of the more valuable books and archives, sometimes giving them to select trustworthy Poles outside of the ghetto walls for safekeeping. He joined his friends in the Paper Brigade, all risking their lives, smuggling manuscripts and books within the ghetto, hiding them in canisters down in the sewers, trying to save their treasured literature in whatever manner they could. My uncle Leib, realizing the importance of documenting ghetto life, kept up his literary activity and often wrote articles for the ghetto newspaper called Trep Steps. My father remembered reading one such article that vividly described the terrifying roundup of an aktion in the ghetto. After some stability began to prevail in the ghetto, Jacob Gens, chief of the ghetto, announced plans for a theater company to be formed inside the ghetto. He believed it would provide relief, hope, and distraction from the fears and the losses everyone was experiencing, that it would also allow actors and writers to be issued work permits, which seemed good for survival. Many intellectuals and rabbis objected strongly to having music in the ghetto, declaring, "You don't perform theater in a graveyard." But the shows went on, and after a while, they too saw the benefits. Working feverishly by candlelight at night, my uncle Leib wrote songs and short musical reviews for the theater, and in collaboration with the other ghetto writers, he created full-length musicals, plays, and satires about the ghetto life, about times gone by, with songs of hope for the future. At times, they would also include in the lyrics of the scripts cryptic messages about plans for the underground resistant movements. Leib's play on words, his witty songs and comedic interchanges made it possible for audiences to see the absurd humor in their own dreadful circumstances. His songs enabled the inmates to laugh at themselves in the midst of their own inescapable suffering, lightening their misery and lifting their spirits. My mother, his little sister Chayala, was a regular feature, singing in the jazz ensembles and eventually playing most of the leading roles in Leib's musicals that soon earned her the title Songstress of Hope, Wunderkind Star of the Vilna Ghetto. Nish gedai gets vet sein besser. Don't despair, it will get better, was the motto that came forth. My uncle's songs were sung by the people attending the performances inside the ghetto, as well as by many in the labor units outside the ghetto. Leib's satiric parody, Pesha von Resha, used the main character of a young girl, Pesha, to reflect on the Meshuggah crazy situation of their lives in the ghetto. His haunting songs, Schottens, Shadows, and Ich ben kaheim, I long for home, emoted the sorrows felt by the ghetto inmates in their distraught situation. When my mother sang that last song, Ich ben kaheim, she was told that even the young German soldiers standing at the back of the ghetto theater were seen with tears running down their faces. They could relate to the Yiddish words so similar to German about missing home. My uncle Leib's song Yisroelik, about a ghetto orphan boy who sings and makes jokes instead of talking about his sorrows, urged people to keep dreaming of a better tomorrow. A time came when Leib had to choose between escaping to the forests with his resistance fighter friends or stay behind in the ghetto to take care of his mother and sisters. Leib remained in the ghetto out of duty to his family and to his commitment to the theater. His partisan friends took with them his stirring songs of resistance as they marched into the woods. His marching song, Zu 1, 2, 3, ahead, 1, 2, 3, moved them forward with lyrics that promised ultimate victory and vindication. The musical shows provided much needed relief and hope for the rapidly dwindling, fear-filled ghetto population. Attending performances in the large auditorium gave them the only opportunity to gather as a community and a chance to learn about what was going on in the ghetto, or to be given hints of escape plans and underground activity. Survivors today still talk of the theater as a miracle. Despite the grim reality of the unpredictable actions, the omnipresent random murders, imminent death and starvation, and even the presence of German and Lithuanian soldiers in the audience, none of those would keep them away, as it was the only source of some possible joy and hope in the midst of terrifying times. My father never forgot his worst night in the ghetto. It was on Yom Kippur night, just as the evening prayers were about to start, when the wooden gates of the ghetto burst open and in stormed a group of uniformed SS men shouting, "Raus, raus zu Arbeit," out to work. They began rounding up men, women, and children from the streets, from the synagogues, from the yards and the cellars. Herding the bewildered people together at gunpoint, they forced them to run towards the street square, where another company of German soldiers and Lithuanian police with machine guns aimed were waiting for them. In that evening darkness, the strict blackout regulations were forgotten. For the first time at night, the streets of the ghetto sparkled with flickering lights of many candles, flashlights, and blinding automobile lights from the German trucks. The SS men began to remove the sick and the elderly from the hospital, using their rifles and bayonets to beat those who didn't or couldn't move. Everyone in the square was being brutally shoved towards the ghetto gates. If people ran too slowly, the Germans kicked them with their boots. The silence of that Jewish holy night was pierced by screams and wild cries of parents and children searching for each other, of Nazi SS men repeatedly barking out their orders, of old men still draped in their prayer shawls, wailing their prayers to the Almighty. As people realized that the Germans had come to take them to their death, they frantically began looking for places to hide. My uncle hid my mother, aunt, and grandmother in one of the secret passages prepared in advance that were quickly opened and closed again when filled. My father, caught in a group, managed to escape the square by moving quickly into the shadows and running as fast as he could to join his father in the attic of their building, their previously designated hideout space. 15 of them, crammed into the smallest space, sat in silence without daring to move. Through the thin walls, they heard heavy steps and Germans shouting curses at the 2 elderly ladies from next door apartment who were too ill to move by themselves. They heard the screams and thumps of the women as they were dragged or thrown down the stairs. Eventually, the mumbled cries and noises outside subsided. And then a neighbor called out from the street in Yiddish, "It's over. It's safe to come outside. The Germans have left the ghetto." The next day, the ghetto was a flurry of people going in and out of the buildings, checking to see if loved ones were okay, or just looking for loved ones. Too many wandered like lost souls, not knowing what to do, for their family members had been snatched up. Children were left without parents, parents bereft of their children, a wife without a husband, a brother without a sister, everyone in shock, dazed by the brutality that had brought such devastating loss and mocked their prayers to be inscribed for another year in the book of life. That Yom Kippur night 80 years ago, the Einsatzkommando Aktion took around 5,000 more people from the Vilna Ghetto number 1. 2 more actions followed that same October, one on Simchas Torah and the other days later, getting rid of another 5,000 or so more Jews and also finally liquidating Ghetto number 2. In the aftermath of the actions, the ghetto's theater group of artists and actors were determined to uplift the spirits again, and so the music productions continued. This cultural and spiritual resistance against the evil of the Nazis showed how, in the face of the most deprived and depraved conditions, people could still rise above their horrific circumstances to create and present art. The shows continued for nearly 2 more years, right up to the last days when the liquidation of the Vilna ghetto had begun. On September 23rd, 1943, when the ghetto was liquidated, my mother was separated from her beloved brother Leib forever. Leib was sent to the forced labor camp, Camp Kluga in Estonia, where a year later he was brutally murdered, forced to lie between pyres of wood, shot, and then burned to death just 1 day before liberation. My mother, her sister, and my grandmother were deported to the labor camp Kaiserwald in Riga. Upon arrival there, selections began. Who looked useful? Who would live? Who was old, sickly, or who should die? My mother stood next to her mother, holding her hand so tightly the SS man was pointing to the left, to the right, to the left, to the right. He looked at my grandmother and pointed to the left. Quickly, she told my mother to go to the right, to leave her, but my mother would not let go. She was holding her hand so tightly, but her mother pushed her away, to the right, the side of life. That day, I and so many millions more lost our right to ever know and feel the love of a grandmother. My father and my mother were among the mere 2,000 or 3,000 Vilna Jews that had survived the actions of the Einsatzkommandos in Vilna, but each still went on to suffer 2 more years of witnessing and experiencing the unimaginable horrors and torture inflicted upon them and other prisoners in the labor and the concentration camps. 2 more years of living with the devastating loss of loved ones, in constant fear of their own imminent death, always hungry and thirsty, their hands bleeding from hard labor, their thin, undernourished bodies shivering in the bitter cold as the winter winds blew through their paper-thin cotton shirts in those many hours standing for roll call, appel, or working all day in the freezing outdoors. 2 more years of inhumane treatment, beatings, humiliation, disease, and starvation, and of unpredictable long train rides in overcrowded cattle trucks or in the dark, dirty bowels of barges that carried them to the next camp. My mother went to Kaiserwald and Sophienwald, my father to Vivikoni, Putkunda, and Burggraben, and then both my parents were sent to Stutthof, and both suffered the enforced death march to the Baltic Sea. Liberated from that certain death by the Soviet army, all survivors of the separate women's and men's death marches were taken to Lauenburg. In Lauenburg, my father found and joined a group of old Vilna friends who took him to meet up with some Vilna Landsmädels, girls from home, who apparently were staying in a nearby house. There, my father found the young singer he had written reviews about before the war and whom he remembered from the ghetto performances. He introduced himself for the first time to the now 21-year-old Chayela, whose frail body was now typhoid fever-ridden. With care and patience, he nursed her back to life and into love. My father emerged from the Holocaust determined to share what he witnessed so that those whose lives were lost would be honored and remembered, so the evil atrocities would be known and recorded in the history books, so that lessons of the past might help prevent more evil, so that all future generations could be spared suffering too, so that a Holocaust would never happen again. He published many Holocaust-related articles in the newspapers and was the catalyst for creating the book In Sacred Memory, in which the war stories of many of our Cape Town survivors were published. Forgive, but do not forget, my father always said. And so we, the next and future generations, must continue to tell the stories and to sing their songs. My Uncle Leib's most famous song, that is still sung by thousands of different singers around the world, speaks of our courage to triumph over evil, to survive no matter what is done to us. His hope and vision for us all to always be able to proudly say, "Wir leben ewig, wir seien da." We live forever. We are still here.
Cantor Choni Goldman from the Garden Shul will now sing the Hazkarah.
למלא רחמים שייכנה במרומים המצא מנוחה נכונה על כנפי השכינה במלאיז קדושים הטהורים כזו ירקיה מזהירים Es nishmois sheishes hamilyon acheinu v'ach yoseinu shenergu v'shenishchatzu v'shenisrefu v'shenitbeu v'shenechneku v'shenikburu chaim al kiddush Hashem al yidei הצוירים הגרמנים והזרעים יימח שמם וזכרם בעבור שיון מספללים עד אזכרס נשמע עשם בגני עדן זהי מנוחסם לכן בעל הרחמים יסתירם בססר כנפה לאוי עלמים ויצרור ביצרור החיים אס נשמסם אדוני הוא נחל עשם וינוחו בשלום על משכבם ונאמר
In closing, I part with the following quote. Only guard yourself and guard yourself carefully, lest you forget the things your eyes saw, lest these things depart from your heart all the days of your lives. And you shall make them known to your children and to your children's children. Deuteronomy 4:9. May we as a community continue to tell the story of the Holocaust to our children, and we look forward to hosting you at the National Unity Ceremony this Yom HaShoah. Thank you.
Thank you.